What will become of Chrisley Confessions if Todd goes to jail? In addition to their TV series, Todd and Julie Chrisley also host a podcast called Chrisley Confessions. The podcast released episode 187 this week. Presently, the couple releases a podcast episode once a week. As those who tune into the podcast regularly know, Todd and Julie make an effort to be consistent and try not to let anything stop them from doing new episodes. This has included recording episodes while on vacation. This has also included recruiting Savannah and Chase to pop onto the podcast in place of a missing parent. The big question fans that tune in to listen to Chrisley Confessions each week is simple. What happens to the podcast if Todd and Julie end up in the slammer? Fortunately, this was a question the couple answered during their most recent podcast episode. During the first 15 to 20 minutes of episode 187 of their podcast, Todd and Julie reassured fans that they would continue to drop episodes of their podcast so long as they were able to do so. The couple didn't if they ended up behind bars. They, however, did proceed to tell fans what plans they had in place for the podcast if they reached a point in time where they could not do episodes of the podcast anymore. Will the podcast stop dropping new episodes of the show if Todd and Julie go to jail? Or does the couple have some sort of plan in place to make sure that never happens? After promising fans the show would go on as long as possible, Todd said that the keys would be passed to his children Savannah and Chase. He explained that if something happened preventing him and Julie from moving forward with the podcast, his children would absolutely take over. Todd Chrisley also promised his fans and followers that his children would include updates on how Julie and himself were doing if they were in a position where they couldn't do the podcast. Neither Todd nor Julie clarified that the something that might take them away from the podcast is jail time, though. As those following the family knows, Todd and Julie Chrisley face up to 30 years behind bars following their guilty verdict. They are presently on house arrest as they await their sentencing hearing. Does it make you happy to know they have plans in place to continue Chrisley Confessions? Let us know in the comments, and keep coming back for the latest on Todd and Julie Chrisley. What will become of Chrisley Confessions if Todd goes to jail? Todd Chrisley, the larger-than-life personality behind the popular reality TV show Chrisley Knows Best, has been the center of public attention for years, not just for his lavish lifestyle, but also for his controversial legal battles. As fans know, the Chrisley family has experienced their fair share of ups and downs, but one of the most notable elements of their rise to fame has been the Chrisley Confessions podcast, where Todd, alongside his wife Julie, and sometimes other family members, shares stories, personal experiences, and their views on life, all with their signature Southern flair. But with Todd's legal troubles looming large and the possibility of a prison sentence hanging over his head, a burning question has emerged. What will happen to Chrisley Confessions if Todd goes to jail? Todd's legal troubles. A brief overview before diving into the implications of Todd's possible incarceration on the podcast. It's important to understand the legal context. In 2019, Todd and Julie Chrisley were indicted on federal charges of tax evasion and fraud. They were accused of hiding their income and using falsified documents to obtain loans. In 2022, the couple was found guilty on multiple counts, and Todd was sentenced to 12 years in prison, while Julie was handed a 7-year sentence. While the Chrisleys have maintained their innocence throughout the legal proceedings, the court's ruling remains. This brings us to a pivotal moment. If Todd serves his time, his absence from Chrisley Confessions would undoubtedly have a significant impact on the podcast, its dynamic, and its overall appeal. The heart of Chrisley Confessions. Todd's role. The success of Chrisley Knows Best is, in many ways, tied to Todd Chrisley's charisma. His unfiltered opinions, humorous anecdotes, and ability to both entertain and, at times, infuriate audiences have made him a standout figure in the world of reality television. Fans are drawn to his unapologetic persona, which simultaneously veers into the realms of over-the-top self-assurance and endearing vulnerability. Todd's role in Chrisley Confessions is similar. As the host and main voice, Todd steers the conversation, whether he's sharing details of the family's personal life, discussing the latest gossip, or offering unsolicited advice to his listeners. He is, without question, the face of the podcast, and his interactions with Julie provide much of the comedic relief that keeps listeners coming back. If Todd goes to jail, that dynamic would potentially take over the podcast, but would the audience connect with her in the same way they connect with Todd? Julie Chrisley, while beloved by many, is often seen as the more grounded and level-headed member of the family. Without Todd's over-the-top antics, Julie's style of communication might not have the same magnetic pull. A shift in podcast dynamics if Todd is incarcerated and Julie steps in to host Chrisley Confessions on her own, we could see a significant shift in the tone of the podcast. Without Todd's larger-than-life presence, the podcast might lose some of its humor and energy. Julie, though no stranger to the spotlight, is known for being more reserved. Her personality, while still charming, lacks the explosive energy Todd brings. She would have to find a way to keep the podcast fresh and engaging without Todd's constant interruptions and zany antics. In fact, it's possible that Chrisley Confessions could transition from being a fun, light-hearted podcast to something more serious and reflective. Julie might use the platform to address her family's legal issues, offering more in-depth commentary on their situation. She could even invite legal experts, family members, or other guests to discuss the case, the legal process, and what it means for their future. This might appeal to a different subset of listeners who are interested in the real-world implications of the Chrisley's legal battles. On the flip side, the podcast could take on a more somber tone if Todd's situation becomes increasingly dire. Julie might feel compelled to lean into a more emotional narrative, using Chrisley Confessions as a way to share her feelings with fans and update them on the legal proceedings. This shift could either bring the audience closer or alienate them, depending on how authentic and raw Julie is willing to be. The role of the family in a post-Todd podcast while Todd's absence from Chrisley Confessions would undoubtedly change the dynamic. It's important to consider the role other family members could play in the podcast moving forward. Savannah, the Chrisley's eldest daughter, is already a public figure in her own right. She has a successful social media following, an entrepreneurial career, and a growing presence as a reality TV personality. It's possible that Savannah could step in to co-host the podcast with Julie, or perhaps even take over the role entirely. Savannah's style is more poised and measured compared to Todd's brashness, but she has a level of relatability and charm that could resonate with listeners. Her maturity and perspective, especially considering the family's legal troubles, could offer listeners a more nuanced view of the situation. However, Savannah would need to strike a delicate balance. While Todd's humor and wit could deflect from the heavier moments of the podcast, Savannah's more serious approach might bring the conversation back to reality. The rest of the Chrisley kids, Chase, Kyle, and Grayson, might also make appearances. Each has a unique personality, and the family could lean on their different strengths to diversify the content of the podcast. Chase, for instance, has a more fun-loving, prankster personality that could help inject some humor into the show. Grayson, though younger, might provide a fresh perspective as the kid in the family. While the family could collectively keep the podcast going, Todd's absence would undoubtedly leave a void that none of them could entirely fill. The success of the podcast, after all, has been built around Todd's unapologetic personality and his interactions with the rest of the family. The potential for a crossover or guest appearance its own way the podcast could survive Todd's imprisonment is through occasional guest appearances or crossovers. While Todd is in prison, he could still potentially be involved in the podcast in some way, either through recorded messages, phone calls, or remote interviews. Depending on the nature of his imprisonment and his availability, Todd might find a way to remain a part of the show, albeit in a limited capacity. These guest appearances could even take on a more poignant, emotional tone, with Todd reflecting on his time behind bars and his hopes for the future. Another interesting possibility is that Todd could record a final series of Chrisley confessions before his sentencing, offering a candid look at his feelings, regrets, and hopes for the family's future. These episodes could be framed as a farewell to the podcast, allowing fans to reflect on his contributions and, perhaps, set the stage for a new direction for the show. Will the podcast survive without Todd ultimately? The success of Chrisley Confessions without Todd Chrisley at the helm depends on a variety of factors. The podcast could continue as an emotionally charged reflection of the Chrisleys' ongoing struggles, with Julie and the family taking a more central role. However, without Todd's humor and bombastic presence, it's unclear.